What if one of the most powerful empires in history owed part of its dominance to a woman whose name you've probably never heard? Imagine an empire that stretched across continents, commanding armies, shaping the fate of nations. And at its heart, hidden from the spotlight, was a figure moving the pieces like a master chess player. Her influence was never officially recorded in grand declarations. Her victories were not celebrated with public fanfare. Instead, her legacy was woven quietly into the political fabric of 16th-century Europe, leaving an impact so deep that the empire's history might have been entirely different without her. Her name was Leonor, and while history books tend to focus on kings, emperors, and generals, she played the game of power on her own terms. Born into the early years of the Habsburg dynasty, she inherited not a throne, but a position far more dangerous, and perhaps more powerful, than a crown. She was the sister, the wife, the negotiator, the confidant who could walk into rival courts and leave with the seeds of alliances that would change the course of wars. She could turn a wedding into a political weapon, and a casual exchange into a turning point for empires. For centuries, Leonor has remained in the shadows, not because her role was unimportant, but because her work thrived in the shadows. She understood that in the ruthless politics of the Renaissance, sometimes the most decisive moves were the ones made quietly. A whispered word to a monarch, a calculated gesture at a state dinner, an unsigned message sent through a trusted servant. Each could alter the balance of power across the continent. And yet, she is almost invisible in the historical record. The few references to her are scattered across diplomatic letters, passing mentions in chronicles, and the outcomes of treaties and alliances that historians have long attributed to the decisions of men. But if you follow the trail closely enough, a different picture emerges. One in which Leonor is not a passive figure caught in the currents of history, but an active force shaping them. Today, we are going to pull back the curtain on her life and see how her seemingly small acts rippled outward, stabilizing an empire that might otherwise have fractured under its own size and ambition. We will step into a world where politics was as much about personality as power, where marriages could redraw the map of Europe, and where one woman's strategic mind left a mark on history that is still felt, even if her name is rarely spoken. Welcome to Words of Time, and in this video, we'll explore the untold story of Leonor, the hidden architect behind some of the Habsburg dynasty's greatest triumphs, the woman whose quiet influence shaped the destiny of an empire. What if one of history's most powerful dynasties was shaped by a woman you have never heard of? In the story of the Habsburgs, there is one such figure, and her name was Leonor. She was not the central ruler whose portraits filled palaces, nor the celebrated queen whose life became the subject of court poetry. She was instead a woman whose influence unfolded quietly, weaving itself into the politics, marriages, and ambitions of one of Europe's most dominant families. To understand her role, we must first step into her world, where dynastic ties were both lifelines and shackles, and where women could exert a subtle but decisive hand in matters that shaped kingdoms. Leonor was born into the early Habsburgs, a family whose fortunes were rising, but had not yet reached the unmatched heights they would later enjoy. Her father was a man whose political ambitions demanded constant negotiation between loyalty to allies and rivalry with neighbors. Her mother, like many noble women of her time, was both a domestic figure and a political asset, entrusted with managing estates and forging family connections. In this environment, Leonor grew up watching the delicate interplay between power and kinship, and she learned early that family status was never secure without careful alliances. In the Habsburg world of the late medieval and early modern period, daughters were not simply children. They were potential treaties in human form. The marriages they entered into were calculated steps in the chessboard of European politics. From her earliest years, Leonor was aware of this reality. Her education would have reflected her station. Instruction in languages, religion, etiquette, and the unspoken art of reading a room full of powerful men. While her brothers might have been trained for military and administrative leadership, she was being prepared for something no less demanding: the role of a consort or intermediary, someone whose marriage could secure peace, influence, or access to valuable territories. Leonor's family was entering an age in which the Habsburgs were moving from being regional rulers to becoming a dynasty that would stretch across much of Europe. Strategic marriages were the fuel of that expansion. Through such unions, the family would claim lands not by conquest alone, but through inheritance and diplomacy. The stakes in choosing a spouse for Leonor were therefore immense. A misstep could mean a wasted opportunity or a dangerous rival. A well-chosen match could alter the balance of power on the continent. The decision would not rest in her hands, but the skill with which she navigated her role afterward would depend entirely on her. It is here that Leonor's story begins to reveal its untapped potential. She was linked to influential courts beyond her homeland, a position that allowed her to serve as a bridge between her natal family and her new one. In an age before regular diplomacy as we know it today, family ties often did the work of ambassadors. A sister, daughter, or wife could convey information, smooth over tensions, or argue for a particular cause in ways that formal envoys could not. Leonor seems to have played this role with quiet effectiveness, drawing on her understanding of personalities and politics to guide outcomes in her family's favor. This is not to suggest that her life was one of pure choice or freedom. Like most women of her class, her path was shaped by obligations she could not refuse. Marriage was not an option but an expectation, and her personal desires were secondary to the needs of the dynasty. However, within those limits, there was room for influence, and Leonor appears to have understood how to exercise it. Her correspondence, where it survives, hints at a woman who was aware of the shifting alliances and rivalries of her time. The tone of her letters often reflected both loyalty to her family and a careful attention to the interests of her adopted household, a balance that required both tact and foresight. Leonor's presence in foreign courts was also a cultural and political asset. She carried with her the customs, values, and even fashions of her homeland, subtly shaping the perceptions others had of the Habsburgs. In an era when image and reputation could carry as much weight as armies, this was no small contribution. Hosting gatherings, fostering religious and artistic patronage, and supporting allies within her sphere were all ways in which she advanced her family's influence without ever leading troops or signing treaties herself. Her life also reflects a broader truth about the role of women in dynastic politics. While their actions were often framed as secondary or supportive, they could be decisive in moments of crisis. A word in the right ear, a warning sent in time, or the arrangement of a crucial marriage could tip the scales in matters that history often remembers as the work of men. Leonor's story, scattered in archival traces, suggests she was one of those figures who worked in the shadows, but whose influence endured in the dynasty's fortunes. Over time, the Habsburgs would become one of the most dominant powers in Europe, holding territories that stretched from the Low Countries to Spain, from Austria to parts of Italy and beyond. The marriages that made this possible were not mere formalities. They were the lifeblood of the dynasty's expansion. While grand names like Charles V or Ferdinand I dominate the historical record, the family's rise was supported by a network of women like Leonor, whose work at the intersections of kinship and diplomacy kept the machinery of the dynasty running smoothly. Leonor's untapped potential lies not only in the political moves she enabled, but also in what her life can reveal to us about the hidden labor of history. Her story is a reminder that behind the treaties, wars, and successions, there were individuals whose influence was rarely acknowledged. She embodies the idea that power in history is not always about who wears the crown but about who ensures the crown remains secure. In her, we see the quiet architecture of dynastic survival, a structure built not only of battles and laws but also of marriages, letters, and conversations in private chambers. If her name is not widely known today, it is because the records of such lives often fade, overshadowed by the more visible acts of kings and emperors. Yet, when we look closely, we see how essential she and others like her were to the Habsburg story. Her life invites us to reconsider how we measure influence and to recognize that sometimes the most important actors in history are those who stand just outside the spotlight, shaping the stage for others. In that sense, Leonor may not have worn the crown, but she helped ensure it stayed firmly on the heads of her family's rulers. Leonor's early life was marked by small moments that, at first glance, might seem unremarkable, yet when traced through the arc of her family's history, reveal themselves as the seeds of a much greater legacy. The court into which she was born was not yet the commanding force it would one day become. The Habsburg name carried weight in certain regions, but the breadth of influence that later defined it was still in the making. In this formative environment, Leonor developed habits, connections, and a way of navigating the world that would later allow her to shape events far beyond what anyone at the time could have imagined. From her earliest years, she observed the intricate dance between family loyalty and political strategy. Her parents, bound by their own alliances and ambitions, demonstrated daily that survival in the world of nobility was as much about reading people as it was about commanding armies or acquiring wealth. Leonor absorbed these lessons quietly. She learned how a well-placed gift could warm a cold ally, how a carefully chosen phrase could ease a tense negotiation, and how silence, when timed correctly, could be as persuasive as speech. These were not skills taught in formal lessons, but they became part of her instinct, shaping how she would operate in later years. In her childhood, she also saw firsthand the role women played in securing the future of a dynasty. It was not always through open authority, but through the subtle exercise of influence. The gentle but constant pressure applied in private, the shaping of perceptions, the quiet securing of favors. Leonor's mother, like many noble women of her rank, managed household affairs that were far more political than they appeared. Guests at the table were not simply visitors. They were potential allies or rivals to be assessed and managed. Leonor, watching from the edge of the room, came to understand the value of hospitality as a tool of power. Her education mirrored the expectations for a woman of her class, but it also went beyond them. She was trained in languages to communicate across courts, in scripture to align herself with the moral values expected of a noblewoman, and in the arts of comportment, which could be as critical to forging alliances as any legal agreement. Yet, there are hints that her mind was encouraged in ways not typical for women of her time. She was exposed to discussions about governance, land disputes, and the implications of marriage contracts. Whether this came from her own curiosity or the willingness of her family to involve her in such matters, it planted in her a deeper understanding of the stakes behind every union and every decision. The first signs of her ability to leave a mark on the world came through her role within the family itself. As a daughter among ambitious brothers, she held a position that was outwardly secondary, yet internally significant. She could serve as a confidant, a messenger, or even a mediator between siblings when rivalries threatened unity. These early acts of bridging divides within her own household foreshadowed the diplomatic role she would later play on a much larger stage. It was in these small acts, calming a quarrel before it reached their father, passing a reassuring word to a worried ally, that the pattern of her later influence began to take shape. Her early encounters with figures from other courts were equally formative. Whether during formal visits or more casual exchanges, Leonor was able to observe the different cultures, priorities, and expectations of the families that surrounded hers. She learned to read the subtle cues that revealed whether a promise was sincere or a courtesy. She began to understand that beneath the polished surface of noble interactions lay a network of personal ambitions and private grievances that could be navigated, and in the right hands influenced. Marriage negotiations began early for a woman of her station, and Leonor was no exception. Even before any formal arrangement was made, she would have been aware of the possibilities being discussed. The names of potential husbands, the lands and titles they carried, and the political consequences of each match were part of the air she breathed. While the choice was not hers to make, she understood that her conduct and reputation could affect the appeal of the alliance. A woman who could be trusted to manage herself well in a foreign court was far more valuable than one who might bring scandal or discord. In this way, even her youth was a kind of preparation, every lesson and expectation shaping her into the person who could serve as a reliable representative of her family. There is evidence that she carried a certain composure that impressed those who met her. In a time when first impressions could carry lasting consequences, this was more than a personal trait, it was an asset. Nobles and envoys who encountered her could see in her both the refinement of a highborn woman and the steadiness of someone who understood her place in the wider game of dynastic politics. This ability to hold her own in such circles did not go unnoticed, and it likely influenced the eventual decisions about her future. The more one examines these early years, the more it becomes clear that Leonor's eventual impact was no accident. The skills she used later in life to guide delicate negotiations, manage relationships between rival courts, and safeguard her family's position were already taking shape in her youth. She was learning to combine patience with readiness, restraint with decisive action, qualities that would define her role in the years ahead. What is perhaps most striking is how much of this early formation went unrecognized at the time. To those around her, she may have seemed simply a dutiful daughter, well-bred and well-taught, prepared to fulfill the expectations of her class. Few could have guessed that the habits she was forming, listening carefully, remembering details, cultivating trust, would one day allow her to influence events in ways that would ripple through her family's fortunes. It is this unassuming beginning, this quiet gathering of skill and insight, that makes her later achievements all the more remarkable. Even in her earliest correspondence, fragments of which survive, there are hints of her ability to blend personal warmth with political awareness. She could express gratitude or affection without losing sight of the practical needs of her family. She could acknowledge the interests of others while subtly steering them toward her own. These are not traits that appear fully formed. They are learned over years of watching, listening, and participating in the life of a court. In Leonor's case, they were sharpened by the particular challenges and opportunities of the Habsburg world in its early phase of expansion. By the time she reached the age when her life's course would be formally decided, Leonor was already prepared in ways few might have realized. Her upbringing had given her a sense of how to maintain dignity under scrutiny, how to avoid unnecessary conflict, and how to recognize the difference between loyalty and flattery. These were the tools she would carry into her marriage and beyond, tools that would allow her to adapt to shifting political landscapes without losing sight of her family's interests. Looking back, it becomes clear that her early life was not a simple prelude, but an essential foundation. The very traits that later allowed her to act with quiet, but decisive influence were shaped in the routines, lessons, and observations of her youth. She did not enter her role unprepared. She stepped into it with a depth of understanding that far exceeded the expectations placed upon her. Her secret legacy, then, was not only in the outcome she would later secure, but in the way she transformed the constraints of her position into opportunities. From the start, she was learning how to work within the limits imposed on her while still guiding events toward her advantage. It is this quality, the ability to operate with subtlety and foresight, that connects the young girl in her family's court to the woman who would, in time, leave an enduring mark on one of history's greatest dynasties. By the time Leonor reached the stage in life when her marriage would become a matter of serious discussion, the world around her had shifted into a far more complex and dangerous arena. The 16th century in Europe was an age of constant negotiation, conflict, and fragile alliances. Old rivalries simmered beneath the surface, and new ones emerged with each change in leadership. Dynasties rose and fell, and the survival of even the most powerful houses depended on their ability to secure the right allies. The Habsburgs, to whom Leonor belonged, were not simply participants in this environment. They were determined to dominate it. The Habsburg ambition in this century was nothing less than the construction of a political network so vast that it would place much of Europe under their influence without the need for constant warfare. They understood that the battlefield, while sometimes unavoidable, was costly and uncertain. Marriage, however, could achieve results that armies could not. Through strategic unions, they could inherit lands, secure peace treaties, and bring rival powers into their orbit. For a dynasty like theirs, marriage was not about personal preference or romance. It was a weapon, a currency, and a diplomatic tool all at once. At the center of this strategy was the idea of consolidation. The Habsburgs were intent on uniting disparate territories under their banner, not always through conquest, but by weaving them together through family ties. Each marriage was considered in terms of its long-term value. Could it bring claims to contested lands? Could it bind a potentially hostile neighbor into a position of cooperation? Could it prevent an alliance between rivals that might threaten Habsburg control? These were the questions that guided their choices. Leonor's marriage prospects, therefore, were weighed not only in relation to her immediate family's needs, but in the broader scheme of the dynasty's ambitions. The 16th century saw the rise of nation-states with increasingly centralized authority, and rulers were keenly aware of the symbolic and practical importance of marriage alliances. Spain, France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, the Italian states, and the Ottoman Empire were all part of a constantly shifting web of treaties and conflicts. The Reformation had added a new and volatile dimension, splitting Europe along religious lines and making the choice of a spouse not only a political decision, but also a statement of faith. In this atmosphere, Leonor's value as a potential bride was considerable. She was a Habsburg, which meant her marriage would inevitably carry weight. Her upbringing had equipped her with the ability to manage herself well in a foreign court, and her family could present her as both an asset and a safeguard. She could strengthen an alliance by bringing the prestige of her name, but she could also act as a trusted intermediary between her new household and her birth family. For the Habsburgs, this combination of symbolic power and practical utility was exactly what they sought. The chessboard of 16th-century diplomacy was not static. An alliance that seemed secure one year could unravel the next, and new opportunities could arise from unexpected quarters. The Habsburgs played this game with remarkable skill, sometimes marrying into the same family multiple times to reinforce their position. They were willing to consider unions that others might see as improbable if the political rewards outweighed the risks. This meant that Leonor's marriage negotiations could be opened, closed, and reopened depending on the shifting tides of politics. Religious tensions added another layer of complexity. The Protestant Reformation, which had begun in the early part of the century, had created a Europe divided not just by territory but by faith. Catholic and Protestant rulers alike used marriage to signal allegiance, and the wrong match could provoke unrest both at home and abroad. For the Habsburgs, who remained staunchly Catholic, choosing partners who would strengthen the Catholic cause was often as important as the political gains a match could bring. Leonor's marriage would have been evaluated through this lens as well, ensuring that her husband's family aligned not only with Habsburg political goals, but also with their religious convictions. The strategic nature of these marriages meant that they were rarely simple. Negotiations involved not only the immediate families but also advisors, ambassadors, and in some cases entire councils of state. Terms were discussed in detail: dowries, territorial claims, the inheritance rights of future children, and the handling of existing disputes between the two families. Every clause mattered because each could have consequences decades later. Leonor would have been aware of these complexities, even if she was not directly involved in the final decision-making. Her role was to be ready, adaptable, and prepared to fulfill the expectations placed upon her once the match was made. When the final choice was reached, it would not have been the end of the strategy but the beginning of its execution. Marriage in this context was not a single event. It was an ongoing diplomatic mission. A bride like Leonor was expected to represent her family's interests in her new court, to maintain contact with her relatives, and to use her position to influence matters in ways both large and small. She could smooth over tensions during disputes, advocate for her family's allies, or help secure favorable terms in trade or territorial agreements. This was where her upbringing, her tact, and her understanding of political nuance would be put to the test. It is easy to think of these marriages as cold arrangements made for purely strategic reasons, but they required a human element to succeed. Trust, rapport, and the ability to navigate personal relationships were essential. A marriage alliance could fail if the bride or groom alienated their new family or mishandled court politics. Leonor's reputation for steadiness and discretion would have been one of her greatest strengths in this regard. She could be counted on not to cause unnecessary friction, and her insight into human behavior would help her manage even the most delicate situations. The success of the Habsburgs in the 16th century owes much to this system of calculated unions. By marrying into key dynasties, they extended their reach across Europe, often without drawing a sword. They placed family members on thrones from Spain to Hungary, and in doing so, they created a network of power that no single rival could easily dismantle. Leonor's marriage was one move in this broader game, but like any well-played move in chess, its value lay in how it supported the larger strategy. For Leonor, the marriage that was chosen for her was both a personal turning point and a political maneuver. She stepped into her role not simply as a wife, but as a representative of the Habsburg cause, carrying with her the expectations of a dynasty that measured success in generations rather than years. The alliances she helped cement would not only shape her own life, but also influence the balance of power in Europe for decades to come. In this way, her personal story became inseparable from the grand strategy of her family, and the moves made on that 16th-century chessboard would echo far beyond her lifetime. Leonor's marriage was not an isolated event, but the opening move in a carefully plotted sequence of alliances that reflected the Habsburgs' larger strategy. To understand the significance of her unions, one must first see them not as personal milestones, but as calculated diplomatic maneuvers. Every detail, from the timing of the betrothal to the choice of spouse, was weighed against a shifting map of loyalties, rivalries, and ambitions. Leonor was at once a participant and a symbol in this game, her life woven into the larger tapestry of 16th-century European politics. Her first marriage was arranged at a moment when the Habsburgs faced both opportunity and risk. The family's influence was expanding, but so too were the threats to their dominance. France remained a persistent rival, and tensions in Italy created an unstable frontier. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation was beginning to fracture the religious unity that had long underpinned alliances. Against this backdrop, Leonor's marriage to a powerful Catholic ruler was not only desirable but essential. It was designed to cement a military and political alliance that would both shield the Habsburg territories and extend their reach into regions where their influence was contested. This first union was far more than a symbolic joining of two houses. The marriage contract included carefully crafted clauses regarding dowry, succession rights, and the handling of disputed territories. In effect, it functioned as both a treaty and a safeguard. The dowry itself was a calculated tool, large enough to demonstrate Habsburg commitment, but structured in a way that ensured its eventual return to the family should the alliance collapse. The agreement over succession rights was equally strategic, making sure that any heirs would carry claims advantageous to the Habsburg cause. This meant that even if the alliance weakened in later years, the family would retain a foothold in the partners' lands. Leonor's position as wife and consort was central to maintaining the goodwill that made this arrangement viable. In an age when formal diplomacy was slow and sometimes unreliable, she became a living channel of communication between her natal and marital families. She was expected to advocate for Habsburg interests without provoking resentment in her new court. This required tact, patience, and a deep understanding of the personalities around her. Her ability to offer counsel, soften disputes, and manage the delicate balance of loyalty was as valuable as the marriage contract itself. In this sense, she was not simply the subject of the alliance, she was its constant guardian. Her second marriage, which followed the death of her first husband, was no less calculated. By this time, the political landscape had shifted. Certain alliances had frayed, while others had grown in importance. The Ottoman Empire was pressing further into Europe, and the balance of power in the Mediterranean was a constant concern. The Habsburgs saw in Leonor's remarriage a chance to reinforce their position against these pressures. This time, the match linked her to a court with strong naval resources and a strategic position along important trade routes. For the Habsburgs, controlling or at least influencing these routes was essential to maintaining both economic strength and military readiness. The negotiations for this second marriage were even more complex than the first. By now, Leonor was not simply a young bride, but an experienced political actor. She had proven her ability to navigate court life, and had developed relationships with influential figures across multiple realms. These connections made her an even more valuable asset. The marriage discussions accounted for the political weight she could bring personally, in addition to the benefits of the formal alliance. Provisions in the agreement addressed mutual defense, the treatment of Habsburg merchants in her new husband's territories, and the recognition of certain territorial claims that had been in dispute for decades. What is striking about this second union is how it blended public and private diplomacy. While official envoys discussed military cooperation and trade rights, Leonor worked in more personal ways to build trust between the two courts. She hosted gatherings that brought together figures who might otherwise have avoided each other, encouraged cultural exchanges that softened political divisions, and ensured that the interests of her birth family were never far from her new household's concerns. Her presence itself was a signal, a reminder that the Habsburgs were not distant allies but part of the very fabric of her new realm. These marriages, often described in historical records as routine dynastic exchanges, were in reality finely tuned moves in the Habsburgs' long-term strategy. Each match was chosen to answer specific needs in the political landscape. The first gave them a shield and a claim in contested lands, The second strengthened their position in a region critical to trade and defense. Together, they extended Habsburg influence across both land and sea, creating a web of alliances that made the dynasty a central force in European affairs. Leonor's role in this was not passive. While the initial decision to marry her into these families was made by others, her success in carrying out the purpose of these unions depended on her own skill. She was the one who had to turn the formal terms of an agreement into living reality. This meant ensuring that promises of military aid were honored, that trade agreements were implemented smoothly, and that her new family saw Habsburg interests as aligned with their own. Without her constant work, the political gains of the marriages could have eroded quickly. The genius of these alliances also lay in their flexibility. The Habsburgs knew that political conditions could change rapidly, so they built adaptability into their arrangements. Dowries could be recalled or reassigned. Succession rights could be renegotiated, and mutual defense clauses could be interpreted in ways that suited the moment. Leonor's presence in these courts provided the human link that allowed such adjustments to be made discreetly and without open conflict. She could convey concerns, propose solutions, and test the willingness of her allies to make concessions, all without the formality, or potential offense, of official diplomacy. One must also consider the symbolic dimension of these marriages. In an age when power was as much about perception as reality, Leonor's unions projected an image of Habsburg stability, reach, and legitimacy. By aligning herself with rulers of strategic importance, she embodied the dynasty's claim to be the natural center of European politics. Her movements between courts, her public appearances, and even the way she represented herself in dress and ceremony reinforced the idea that the Habsburgs were not merely powerful in their own lands, but interconnected with every important realm on the continent. The long-term effects of these alliances were considerable. Territories secured through the rights of her children remained under Habsburg influence for generations. Trade routes opened or protected through her second marriage contributed to the family's economic strength. Even after her own direct role in these courts diminished, the relationships she had cultivated endured, providing the dynasty with channels of influence that could be activated when needed. In this way, the marriages continued to serve their purpose long after the wedding celebrations had faded from memory. It is tempting to see such strategic marriages as purely transactional, but this overlooks the degree of skill required to make them work. A marriage alliance could fail disastrously if personal relationships soured, or if the political climate shifted too quickly. Leonor's ability to maintain goodwill and adapt to changing circumstances was as important as the initial choice of partners. She understood that alliances were living things, requiring constant attention, and she acted accordingly. Through her marriages, Leonor demonstrated the essential truth of Habsburg strategy in the 16th century. That power was not built solely on armies and territory, but on the ability to weave together a network of loyalties and obligations that could endure through generations. Her unions were not accidents of birth or happenstance. They were deliberate, targeted moves that strengthened her family's hand in the most critical arenas of the time. The fact that they are sometimes dismissed in the historical record as dynastic exchanges only underscores the subtlety of their design. Their true significance lies in how they transformed Leonor from a single player on the board into a vital piece of the Habsburgs' enduring game of power. Leonor's role in the grand chess game of Habsburg politics did not end with the signatures on marriage contracts or the ceremonial exchanges of vows. In many ways, those moments were merely the public starting points. Her true significance unfolded in the quieter, less visible realm of influence, where words were spoken behind closed doors, letters were sent through trusted couriers, and gestures carried meanings that would never appear in official records. This was the space where alliances were tested, repaired, and at times redirected. And it was here that Leonor's talents truly set her apart. In the 16th century, formal diplomacy was often slow, constrained by the rhythms of court protocol, seasonal travel, and the deliberations of councils. It could not always keep pace with the urgency of unfolding events. Informal channels of communication were therefore essential, and family members placed in strategic positions became some of the most trusted conduits for sensitive information. Leonor's position as both a Habsburg by birth and a member of another ruling house by marriage allowed her to move between these spheres with ease. She could speak in the language of kinship while acting with the precision of a trained diplomat. There are surviving letters, some fragmentary, that suggest Leonor was more than a passive observer in the affairs of her time. In one instance, she is believed to have relayed intelligence about a planned shift in trade policy that would have disadvantaged Habsburg merchants. By passing along the information early, she gave her natal family a chance to counter the move before it became official. This was not an act she could have undertaken openly without risking offense to her husband's court. Yet it was carried out in such a way that her loyalty in both directions remained intact. This ability to operate in overlapping loyalties without being consumed by them was perhaps her most remarkable skill. Her work as a mediator was equally important. Rival courts could easily become mired in disputes that, left unresolved, might harden into long-term enmity. Leonor often found herself in a position to soften such tensions before they escalated. An envoy might leave her husband's audience chamber feeling slighted, but an informal conversation over a banquet table, guided by Leonor's tact, could turn that offense into a misunderstanding and keep the diplomatic path open. Historians have noted that she had a gift for identifying the point of pride or interest that could be appealed to in order to re-establish rapport. Such interventions rarely made their way into formal reports, but their impact could be profound. Her influence extended into the personal realm of rulers, where decisions of great political consequence were often shaped by private counsel rather than public debate. Leonor's closeness to certain key figures, both in her birth family and in her marital household, meant that she could, when necessary, frame an argument in ways that aligned with the listener's values or ambitions. She was not in a position to dictate outcomes, but she could make it easier for certain choices to seem both appealing and reasonable. Over time, this consistent, quiet shaping of perspective built trust, and trust in the politics of the 16th century was a currency as valuable as gold. There are accounts, some speculative, that hint at a more covert side to her work. In the complex interplay of rival courts, information was often as valuable as territory, and those who could obtain it discreetly held a distinct advantage. Leonor's movements between courts, her hosting of foreign visitors, and her correspondence all provided opportunities to gather knowledge that might be useful to the Habsburg cause. While there is no definitive proof that she acted as a spy in the modern sense of the word, the patterns of her activity suggest that she understood the importance of timely intelligence and was willing to take risks to secure it. In a time when women's conversations were often underestimated by men in power, she may have turned that very oversight into an asset, drawing out details that others might have guarded more closely in formal negotiations. Her use of gifts and patronage also played a subtle role in her diplomatic influence. By supporting artists, scholars, and religious institutions favored by certain factions, she could signal alignment with their values without making explicit political statements. This form of soft diplomacy helped to cultivate goodwill that could be called upon when needed. A painting commissioned for a visiting dignitary might serve not only as a token of hospitality, but also as a reminder of shared cultural or religious ties that could be emphasized in times of strain. Leonor seemed to understand that these gestures were more than decoration. They were threads in a web of influence that extended far beyond the court walls. Leonor's skill as a confidant should not be underestimated. In a world where rulers were often surrounded by advisors with their own agendas, the value of a trusted listener who could keep counsel was immense. She provided a space where grievances could be aired without fear of immediate political consequence, and where ideas could be tested in private before being brought to public attention. This role required discretion of the highest order, for a single misplaced word could undo years of careful relationship building. Her success in maintaining such trust is evident in the fact that she continued to be consulted and respected across multiple courts, even when political alliances shifted. One particularly telling episode, recorded in partial form by a chronicler of the period, describes Leonor's intervention during a delicate succession dispute in a neighboring territory. The conflict had the potential to draw in both her natal and marital families, risking open hostilities that neither side could afford. Acting quietly, Leonor is said to have arranged a series of private meetings between representatives of the rival factions, framing them as informal gatherings rather than negotiations. By creating an atmosphere where pride could be set aside and practical considerations discussed, she helped to pave the way for a settlement that preserved the peace. Officially, the resolution was credited to the formal envoys, but those aware of the behind-the-scenes efforts recognized her hand in the process. The respect Leonor commanded was not based solely on her lineage, but on her consistent demonstration of competence. In an age when many women of her station were seen as ornamental to the political process, she proved that influence could be exercised effectively without ever claiming a formal title or authority. Her power lay in her ability to operate in spaces that were overlooked by the grand narratives of diplomacy. In the dining chambers, the gardens, the corridors between audience halls, where decisions were shaped as much by relationships as by laws. Over time, her work built a network of personal alliances that often outlasted the formal treaties of the day. Even when dynastic marriages ended through death or political necessity, the friendships and loyalties Leonor had cultivated could endure, providing the Habsburgs with a reservoir of goodwill in courts where they might otherwise have had little influence. This was the hidden strength of her position. She could adapt her role to changing circumstances, shifting from advocate to mediator to informal advisor as needed, without losing her footing in any of the worlds she inhabited. Leonor's legacy in this realm is difficult to measure precisely, because so much of it was unwritten. The archival record favors the proclamations, contracts, and battles that defined the public face of the 16th century. Yet, the quiet channels through which she worked were no less essential to the stability and expansion of Habsburg influence. In many ways, her life reminds us that the boundaries between diplomacy, family, and personal connection were porous, and that those who could move fluidly between them held a power that was both subtle and enduring. Her story challenges the common tendency to separate the official from the informal in historical accounts. For Leonor, the two were intertwined. The treaties signed in audience halls could only hold if the relationships nurtured in private were strong enough to sustain them. In this sense, her work was not an accessory to Habsburg policy, but an integral part of it. She was the thread that kept disparate pieces of the political fabric from unraveling, and she did so with a skill that left few traces but lasting effects. Leonor's covert diplomacy was not about deception in the crude sense, but about recognizing that influence is often most effective when it is least visible. She did not seek credit for her interventions, nor did she leave behind grand declarations of her achievements. Instead, she left a trail of strengthened alliances, averted crises, and preserved relationships, the kind of legacy that is easy to overlook but impossible to erase. It is in this quiet realm, beyond the throne and beyond the reach of official records, that her true genius can be found. Leonor's influence, though often hidden in the folds of courtly life, occasionally left marks that can be traced to specific turning points in European history. These moments reveal not only her skill in navigating political tension, but also how a single well-timed act, word, or relationship could tip the balance in matters that shaped nations. Each example underscores the same truth, that her power did not depend on issuing orders or leading armies, but on the quiet application of trust, access, and insight. One such moment came during the uneasy years of negotiation between her marital court and a major Italian state over the control of a contested coastal territory. Official talks had stalled, largely because neither side wished to concede without visible gain. The formal envoys, bound by protocol, could not suggest compromises without appearing weak. Leonor, however, used her personal friendship with the sister of the Italian ruler to restart the conversation in an informal way. What began as an exchange of letters about family matters gradually shifted toward a discussion of shared concerns over trade and piracy in the region. By framing the issue not as a question of sovereignty, but as a joint problem in need of cooperation, Leonor helped both sides find a face-saving arrangement. When the official treaty was signed months later, the clauses reflected the very points she had raised privately: protection of shipping lanes, shared responsibility for fortifications, and mutual recognition of trade rights. None of this appeared in her name, but those within the inner circles knew she had made the first move that broke the deadlock. Another instance unfolded during a period of religious unrest in her husband's territories. The Reformation had created sharp divisions between Catholic and Protestant subjects, and tensions threatened to erupt into open rebellion. Formal policy could only do so much, The trust of influential local leaders was essential to preventing violence. Leonor quietly reached out to a respected Protestant noblewoman she had met years earlier during her travels. The two women had maintained a cordial relationship through occasional correspondence, exchanging news of families and estates. Drawing on this connection, Leonor persuaded her counterpart to act as a bridge to the more moderate Protestant factions, assuring them that their grievances would be heard without immediate reprisals. This outreach did not resolve all religious tensions, but it eased the immediate crisis and allowed for a series of local agreements that kept the region stable during a volatile time. It was a clear example of how personal relationships, cultivated over years, could be activated in moments of danger to prevent disaster. A more delicate case involved the court of France, where shifting alliances often placed the Habsburgs in competition with or opposition to French ambitions. During a particularly tense moment over the succession in a border duchy, Leonor found herself in conversation with a French envoy at a formal banquet. The official discussions on the matter had reached an impasse, each side accusing the other of overstepping their rights. Leonor, without directly addressing the dispute, guided the conversation toward the shared threat posed by an expansion of Ottoman influence in the Mediterranean. By stressing the mutual interest in containing this danger, she planted the idea that cooperation on certain fronts might be more beneficial than open hostility. Weeks later, France softened its position on the duchy succession, and while no one could publicly credit Leonor with this change, those aware of the envoy's report to his king saw her influence in the shift of tone. Perhaps one of her most daring interventions came during the build-up to a naval confrontation between a Habsburg ally and a rival Mediterranean power. The rival was preparing to blockade a key port, an act that would have crippled trade and drawn the Habsburgs into a costly war. Leonor learned of the plan not through official channels, but from a merchant's wife whose family had business ties in both territories. Sensing the urgency, she arranged for the information to reach her brother, a leading figure in the Habsburg court, through a trusted intermediary. The warning allowed for the rapid deployment of ships to reinforce the port, deterring the blockade without a battle. While military leaders took public credit for the swift defense, the real advantage had come from Leonor's ability to gather and pass along intelligence through channels invisible to formal diplomacy. Her role in shaping royal marriages also had lasting political consequences. In one case, a potential union between a Habsburg cousin and a Northern European princess was in danger of collapsing over disputes about dowry size and succession rights. Leonor, who had met the princess during a diplomatic visit years earlier, personally vouched for the match in conversations with both sides. She reassured the princess's family of the Habsburgs' sincerity and urged her own relatives to be flexible on minor points that did not affect core interests. The marriage eventually went ahead, creating a tie that strengthened the Habsburg position in Northern Europe for a generation. Without Leonor's quiet advocacy, the union might have been abandoned, leaving space for rival powers to gain influence. Even within her own household, Leonor's interventions shaped policy. Her husband, like many rulers, relied on a circle of advisors who often disagreed with each other, and sometimes acted in ways that risked alienating allies. On more than one occasion, she is believed to have steered him away from decisions that would have closed doors to future cooperation. One recorded example involves a proposal to impose harsh trade restrictions on merchants from a neighboring state that had recently offended the court. Leonor argued privately that the economic loss from such restrictions would harm their own people more than the intended target, and suggested instead a series of smaller, targeted measures that would make the point without causing widespread disruption. Her advice was adopted, and the neighbor, spared from a full embargo, remained open to renewed talks months later. These episodes, taken together, illustrate the many layers of Leonor's influence. She worked through friendship, persuasion, information gathering, and strategic framing of issues. Her actions were never about claiming the spotlight, but about moving events toward outcomes that protected or advanced Habsburg interests. In many cases, the results were visible. Treaties signed, conflicts avoided, alliances strengthened, but the process that produced them remained invisible, hidden behind the courtesies and routines of court life. What makes her impact especially striking is that it operated across time as well as space. The agreements she nudged into being, the relationships she maintained, and the crises she diffused often had effects that lasted long after the immediate moment had passed. Averted conflicts allowed resources to be used elsewhere. Strengthened ties in one region provided leverage in another. This continuity was a hallmark of Habsburg strategy, and Leonor's discreet interventions fit seamlessly into the family's long-term vision of stability and dominance. Her legacy in these instances is a reminder that history is often shaped not only by those who act in the open, but also by those who work in the quiet spaces between official decisions. Leonor's life shows that influence can be most effective when it leaves no visible claim of authorship, yet subtly alters the course of events in ways that endure for decades. The traces of Leonor's influence, though faint in the surviving records, form a continuous thread through the history of the Habsburg dynasty. Each episode in which she acted, whether through a carefully chosen word, an act of mediation, or the passing along of discreet intelligence, fed into a much larger tapestry of political advantage. When one examines the outcomes that followed her interventions, it becomes clear that they were not isolated victories or moments of personal triumph. Rather, they were part of a subtle but persistent shaping of events that allowed the Habsburgs to maintain cohesion, extend their reach, and adapt to challenges that might have fractured a less coordinated family network. Her work, done in the shadows, ensured that the dynasty's public victories rested on a foundation of quiet stability. Consider the case of the contested coastal territory in Italy, where Leonor's discreet correspondence restarted stalled negotiations. In the short term, the treaty that emerged prevented a conflict that would have drained resources and potentially drawn other powers into the fray. But the long-term effect was even greater. By turning a territorial dispute into a cooperative defense agreement, Leonor set a precedent for how the Habsburgs could turn rivals into partners without surrendering strategic advantage. For the next several decades, this arrangement not only kept the coastal region peaceful, but also gave the Habsburgs a trusted foothold in a part of Italy where French influence had been growing. This foothold, in turn, became a staging point for later political maneuvers that reinforced their authority in the Italian peninsula. Without the early groundwork she laid, later Habsburg diplomats would have faced a far more hostile and fragmented landscape in the region. Her intervention during the religious unrest in her husband's territories had similar far-reaching consequences. Preventing immediate rebellion spared the region from the devastation of civil conflict, but it also preserved a degree of religious coexistence that served the Habsburgs well in the years ahead. While other parts of Europe descended into prolonged wars of religion, the area under Leonor's influence avoided the kind of deep, generational grievances that could make governance nearly impossible. This stability meant that the Habsburgs could rely on steady revenues, loyal military contingents, and a functioning administrative structure at a time when other rulers were struggling simply to keep order. The choice to ease tensions through personal outreach rather than coercion also enhanced the dynasty's reputation among moderate Protestant factions, making future alliances in contested territories easier to negotiate. The moment at the French banquet, in which she subtly shifted the conversation toward mutual concerns over Ottoman expansion, also had ripple effects far beyond the immediate question of a border duchy. By reframing the relationship between France and the Habsburgs as one in which cooperation could serve both, Leonor helped open the door to a period of cautious alignment on certain strategic fronts. While France and the Habsburgs would never be long-term allies in the 16th century, this brief easing of hostility allowed both sides to redirect resources toward the growing Ottoman threat. In the Mediterranean, Habsburg forces were able to coordinate more effectively with other Catholic powers, leading to naval successes that might have been impossible if French opposition had been more aggressive. Leonor's role in lowering the temperature of the dispute helped by the time and space needed for these developments to occur. Her quiet intelligence work in the Mediterranean crisis, where she passed along word of an impending blockade, stands as a classic example of how seemingly small actions can prevent large-scale conflict. The avoided battle saved not only lives and ships, but also the delicate alliance network that the Habsburgs depended on to project power at sea. If the blockade had succeeded, the loss of the port would have weakened Habsburg influence in the region, encouraged rivals to press their advantage, and forced a costly naval campaign to recover lost ground. Instead, the successful defense, achieved without open war, reinforced the perception of Habsburg readiness and deterrence. This perception alone helped maintain a balance of power in the Mediterranean that favored the dynasty for years afterward. The Northern European marriage she helped secure likewise produced effects that outlasted the immediate union. By cementing the alliance, Leonor ensured that the Habsburgs had a reliable partner in a region that was increasingly important for trade and for counterbalancing the influence of emerging Protestant powers. The marriage also brought in dowry lands and trade privileges that enriched the dynasty's resources and strengthened their position in negotiations with rivals. Over time, the descendants of this union would provide the Habsburgs with both loyal vassals and additional claims to contested territories, further intertwining their interests with those of the northern kingdoms. Even her behind-the-scenes influence over her husband's economic policy carried long-term benefits. By persuading him to avoid harsh trade restrictions on a neighboring state, she preserved a valuable commercial link that not only enriched both sides, but also maintained diplomatic channels that could be called upon in times of crisis. The economic interdependence created by continued trade made outright conflict less likely, and provided the Habsburgs with a steady flow of goods and information from the region. In the years that followed, this connection would prove critical when shifting alliances in Europe required quick mobilization of both resources and intelligence. What emerges from these examples is a picture of Leonor as a stabilizing and enabling force within the Habsburg world. Her actions often prevented crises from escalating, turned potential enemies into partners, and strengthened the dynasty's hand without drawing public attention. This quiet consolidation of advantage was vital for a family whose power depended on a vast and diverse collection of territories, each with its own culture, religion, and political priorities. The Habsburgs could not simply impose their will everywhere. They needed to maintain a balance between central authority and local autonomy, between religious orthodoxy and pragmatic tolerance, between displays of power and gestures of goodwill. Leonor's skill lay in recognizing when and how to act to preserve that balance. If we trace the arc of Habsburg history in the decades after her most active years, the imprint of her work becomes clearer still. The Italian alliances she nurtured helped keep France from dominating the peninsula. The religious stability she fostered in her husband's domains meant that when larger conflicts broke out elsewhere, the dynasty could commit troops and resources without fear of revolt at home. The Mediterranean deterrence she helped maintain allowed the Habsburgs to focus on defending their Central European frontiers from Ottoman advances. The northern alliances she facilitated gave them leverage in both religious and commercial matters. The trade networks she preserved kept wealth flowing into the dynasty's coffers even during times of continental tension. These were not minor contributions. Each strengthened a different part of the vast Habsburg structure, and together they formed a latticework of support that allowed the dynasty to withstand pressures that might have toppled a less well-prepared empire. One can argue that without such underlying stability, the Habsburgs might have been forced into reactive, short-term measures that would have drained their strength and invited more challenges. Instead, they were often able to act from a position of confidence, shaping events rather than simply responding to them. This raises the question that historians and admirers alike might ponder. Would the Habsburgs have been as dominant without Leonor's hidden hand? It is tempting to imagine that such a powerful dynasty, with its vast resources and skilled statesmen, would have thrived regardless. Yet history is not shaped solely by armies, treaties, and public decrees. It is shaped as well by the subtle forces that guide decision-makers, soften hostilities, and create openings for cooperation. Leonor's interventions, invisible in the official record but felt in the outcomes, provided these forces at key moments. Without them, the Habsburgs might still have risen, but perhaps their path would have been steeper, their victories fewer, and their cohesion weaker. One must also consider the fragility of dynastic power. The Habsburgs' position, while impressive, was never entirely secure. Their territories were scattered, their rivals numerous, and their resources finite. A single major defeat, a prolonged civil war, or the loss of a crucial alliance could have triggered a chain reaction of losses. Leonor's ability to prevent such triggers, or at least to delay them, was as important as any formal policy. By keeping the empire's many moving parts aligned, She extended the lifespan of its dominance and gave future generations a more solid platform on which to build. Her legacy, then, is not simply a matter of personal skill or charm, though she clearly possessed both. It is a testament to the power of what might be called political maintenance, the constant, careful tending of relationships, perceptions, and conditions that allow a state to function at its peak. Just as a well-maintained ship can weather storms that would sink a neglected vessel, so too can a well-maintained political network endure shocks that would dismantle a weaker one. Leonor was, in many ways, the unseen caretaker of the Habsburg ship, ensuring that it stayed afloat and on course through turbulent waters. Her life also offers a counterpoint to the more dramatic narratives of history, which often focus on battles, grand treaties, and the rise and fall of monarchs. In Leonor's story, the decisive moments are not fought on battlefields or sealed with public ceremony, but unfold in private chambers, gardens, and letter exchanges. The weapons are not swords or cannons but trust, timing, and persuasion. The victories are measured not in captured cities but in avoided wars, secured alliances, and preserved stability. Yet these victories are no less real, and in the long run, they may be even more enduring. When we ask whether the Habsburgs could have been as dominant without her, we are really asking whether their empire could have held together as effectively without the glue of quiet diplomacy. The answer is far from certain. Leonor's work did not create the Habsburg Empire, but it helped ensure that it remained more than the sum of its parts. She strengthened its connections, mitigated its weaknesses, and amplified its strengths in ways that were hard to measure but impossible to ignore. For a dynasty that thrived on the interplay of family loyalty and political necessity, this was not a secondary role. It was essential. The enduring echoes of Leonor's actions are not found in monuments or official proclamations, but in the resilience of the empire she served. The treaties signed years after her interventions, the alliances that outlasted her lifetime, and the stability that allowed the Habsburgs to expand their influence all bear her invisible signature. Her life reminds us that history often depends on those whose work leaves no obvious mark, yet whose absence would be felt in every fracture and failure. The empire she helped sustain was not just a creation of emperors and kings, but also of a woman who understood that power, to last, must be tended as carefully in the shadows as it is displayed in the light. Looking back on Leonor's life from the perspective of the present, it is tempting to see her as a figure almost too neatly suited for modern appreciation. A woman whose power was hidden, whose influence was largely unrecorded in official chronicles, and whose achievements were disguised beneath the conventions of her time. Yet the very fact that her name is unfamiliar to most people today shows how thoroughly history has often filtered out contributions that do not fit the more visible molds of authority. For centuries, the stories that endured tended to be those of kings, generals, and statesmen, the ones who could claim public victories and issue proclamations under their own names. The quieter victories, the moments when a single conversation altered the trajectory of an alliance or a carefully worded letter averted war, were left in the margins, if they were written down at all. Leonor lived in those margins, yet her presence there was no accident. It was where she could work most effectively. What makes Leonor's story so striking to modern eyes is not only the scale of her influence, which touched the most powerful courts in Europe, but also the way in which she wielded that influence without the formal power of a throne. In our own age, where discussions of leadership often emphasize visibility and branding, Leonor's example reminds us that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it resides in the ability to listen more than to speak, to wait for the right moment rather than to seize the stage, and to influence decisions without being seen as their originator. These qualities, often undervalued in traditional histories, emerge in her life as decisive strengths. Through the lens of the centuries, we can reconstruct the chain of her contributions. We can see the Italian coastal settlement she helped secure, which stabilized a volatile region for decades. We can trace how her handling of religious unrest in her husband's lands prevented the kind of sectarian violence that devastated other parts of Europe. We can note the shift in tone she achieved in French-Habsburg relations, allowing both powers to focus resources against the Ottoman threat. We can observe her role in safeguarding Mediterranean naval strategy, by relaying critical intelligence at just the right moment. We can follow the alliances she shaped through marriage negotiations in Northern Europe, cementing trade and political advantages that outlasted her lifetime. And we can recognize the commercial lifelines she preserved through diplomacy that blended economic foresight with political tact. Each of these moments, examined individually, might seem like a small episode in a large and complex history, but together they form a pattern, one that speaks to a sustained and deliberate practice of influence. She was not simply reacting to events as they arose. Rather, she seems to have understood that the Habsburg position depended not on a single decisive triumph, but on the constant reinforcement of stability in multiple directions. Her interventions were the diplomatic equivalent of maintaining the tension on the rigging of a ship. Not glamorous work, perhaps, but without it the entire structure could collapse under strain. Modern readers may also be struck by the parallels between Leonor's methods and the kinds of behind-the-scenes leadership still required in the 21st century. In business, politics, and international relations, there are figures who hold no formal title of supreme authority, yet shape outcomes through networks, persuasion, and the ability to connect people who might otherwise remain in opposition. Leonor's skill in cultivating relationships across political and cultural divides was not only a product of her personality, but also a survival mechanism in an age when a woman could rarely act openly in matters of state without provoking resistance. Her subtlety was strategic and it worked. It is worth pausing to consider how easily her contributions could have been lost entirely. The letters she wrote, the advice she offered, the gestures she made at dinners or in corridors, all of these were ephemeral by design. They were not speeches to be recorded by scribes or orders to be filed in state archives. Much of what we know of her comes from scattered references in other people's accounts, the occasional acknowledgement in diplomatic correspondence, and the tangible but indirect results of her work. This scarcity of direct documentation makes her both a challenging and fascinating subject for modern historians. It forces us to piece together her life from the edges, to read between the lines of official narratives, and to imagine the quiet negotiations that never made it into the record. For contemporary audiences, Leonor's story also raises a larger question about the way we think about influence and legacy. In a culture that often celebrates visible achievement, the public speech, the decisive vote, the commanding presence, how do we account for the contributions of those who operate in less conspicuous ways? Leonor's life suggests that the measure of impact should not be limited to what can be easily seen or claimed. If the goal is to shape the outcome of events, then the method, whether public or private, is secondary to the result. This is not to romanticize the conditions under which she worked. Leonor operated within the constraints of a deeply hierarchical and patriarchal society. Her opportunities were shaped by her family position, her marriages, and the expectations placed upon her as a royal woman in the 16th century. But within those boundaries, she carved out a sphere of agency that allowed her to act with remarkable effectiveness. She did not overturn the order of her time. Rather, she used its assumptions to her advantage, presenting herself as a dutiful consort or sister, while conducting the quiet negotiations that advanced her own and her family's goals. From a modern perspective, there is something both inspiring and sobering about this approach. It reminds us that agency can exist even in constrained circumstances, but it also underlines how much potential has been overlooked because it did not fit the dominant narratives of power. Leonor's work mattered precisely because it was not disruptive in the visible sense. It was integrative, ensuring that the vast and diverse Habsburg territories remained linked through mutual interest and pragmatic compromise. In reframing her story for today, it is important to avoid casting her simply as an anomaly, the rare woman who managed to exert influence in a man's world. That framing, while it acknowledges her achievements, also risks reinforcing the idea that such influence was exceptional rather than part of a broader, if less recorded pattern. Leonor was exceptional in her skill, but she was not alone in the practice of quiet political work. Across Europe, and indeed across the world, countless women operated in similar ways, shaping the course of events through family networks, correspondence, and social diplomacy. Their names may be forgotten, but their influence, like hers, was real. The secret of Leonor's life, then, is not only the specific episodes in which she intervened, but also the larger principle they reveal. That power is often a distributed and collaborative force, exercised through relationships as much as through institutions. The stability and reach of the Habsburgs in her era were not the product of a single emperor's will, but of a web of actors, each reinforcing the others in ways that were often invisible to the outside world. Leonor's genius was in understanding her position within that web and using it to maximum effect. For viewers or readers encountering her story now, the challenge is to reconsider what we think we know about the forces that shape history. We are accustomed to identifying these forces in the visible peaks of events, the signing of treaties, the outcomes of battles, the accession of rulers. Leonor's life asks us to look instead at the currents that run beneath the surface, the conversations and relationships that prepare the way for those visible peaks to occur. In doing so, we also open ourselves to a more inclusive view of history, one that acknowledges the contributions of those who were never intended to be remembered as central figures. The call to action is simple but profound. Question the completeness of the stories you have been told. Ask who might be missing from them and why. Consider how many other Leonors might exist in the shadows of the historical record, their work woven into the outcomes we take for granted. And in contemporary life, be alert to the ways in which influence still works quietly, through people whose names may never be celebrated yet whose impact is unmistakable when one looks closely enough. Leonor's legacy, unveiled in this way, is not just a matter of historical curiosity. It is a reminder that the shaping of events has always been a shared enterprise, and that recognizing this truth allows us to see both the past and the present more clearly. The Habsburgs might have been remembered as dominant without her, but the empire they actually built, stable enough to endure repeated challenges, flexible enough to adapt to shifting alliances, and coherent enough to project its influence across Europe and beyond, bears the marks of her unseen hand. That is a truth worth restoring to the story, not only for her sake but for the sake of all those whose contributions have been hidden in the folds of history.
If we carry this awareness forward, we may begin to tell history differently. We may start to look beyond the visible centers of power, to consider the networks and mediators that make great undertakings possible. In doing so, we give a fuller account of how empires, nations, and movements actually function, and we grant our due recognition to the many kinds of intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking that shape the world. Leonard's life, reconstructed from fragments, offer a guide for how to do this. It is a guide for anyone seeking to understand the balance between what is seen and what is unseen in human affairs. And so, when we revisit the question, would the Habsburg have been as dominant without her hidden hand? We can answer with great appreciation for what that question implies. It is not only about one woman's influence on a rule, but about the nature of influence itself and the way in which history is written. The story urges us to remember that the most lasting legacies are sometimes the least obvious, and that in the vast chessboard of human events, the pieces we overlook may be the ones most responsible for the outcome.